Welcome to RickRackRuby. I'm Laura Cluvo. Today we will make this scrappy patchwork tree ornament. It's fun and easy, so let's get started. The scrappy patchwork tree ornament is created with foundation piecing. That's kind of like a log cabin block. The pattern is a triangle with sort of rounded corners. I will describe the pattern for you later on in the video. I've cut it from this 50 weight Pellon. It's non-fusible. And I've drawn a line up the center. That's going to help me keep the pieces centered. Then I've cut a 1 3/4 inch square. It's really important to start with that exact size. Cut the square in half along the diagonal, and this will be the start of the foundation piecing. So line that up right there with the point right in the center and the edge along the bottom. We're going to create a piece like this. So I'll start adding the 1 inch strip. These are all my 1 inch strips. I started off making this from scraps, and then it was so much fun that I started cutting some of the strips from fresh new fabrics. I'm gonna lay the first strip here, then I'm gonna press it. That's why I have my iron here. I don't usually, this is one of those irons that goes up and down, by the way, so it makes that noise. And then, let's see, here's the start. Then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 different green prints. The top one is the same as the bottom, but it doesn't have to be. And there are 2 strips on, one on either side. And I have this machine feather stitch in between. You can use whatever embroidery stitch you like. To begin with the first strip, I'm going to set this edge even with the side of the triangle. I'm going to overlap it about 1/2 inch, and I mean overlap on the other side of the pencil line. I don't really use pins, but let's pretend I have it pinned there. And then I'm going to stitch with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. I move the needle on my machine all the way to the right, and I'm lining it up with the edge of the presser foot. So I have the smallest seam allowance that I can easily manage. Now I'm going to fold this back and press it. And now this is important. Before I move on to the next step, and of course I can trim this, I'm going to be sure to trim this at a 90-degree angle so that this strip is fresh and ready to begin. But it's important, after every seam, we've got to get the machine embroidery in there so that there's no raw edge to the embroidery. It's kind of sealed in between the different strips. I'll show you what I mean. Right now I'm going to go ahead and program my Bernina to do this machine feather stitch. And there it is. Now this is important. I made a lot of these to figure all of this out. The second strip, I'm going to line up with the triangle, and I'm going to overlap the first strip. I'm going to stitch it. But since I have my needle all the way over to the right, I'm going to have to sew from the bottom up, because that's going to provide me with that little baby seam allowance. Then I'll fold that over. Trim. I want to be sure that this edge is over the line. Press and feather stitch. Even though I sewed the seam from the bottom up, I'm going to feather stitch from the top down so that the feathers go in the same direction on both sides. And there's our first set of strips. The strips are 1 inch wide. So I'll continue to add strips, 1/8 inch seam allowance, fold it over, press, feather stitch, repeat. Also, if you have a vertical pattern, it's fun to use these vertical strips. Here's another one. The vertical strips in this design, they just add a lot of movement. Just be sure to keep the top of the design at the top of the project. So the neck, I'll show you. Okay, so this, I'm gonna consider this the top of the print because I like the holly leaves to travel down. So I'll make sure that I put this one here like this. I'm overlapping the line. Then I'll fold it over, press, and feather stitch. This second, or I would say maybe the second strip should go right to the corner. Okay, now I want my leaves to go down. So I'm actually working from the opposite end of the strip. So I'll stitch and I'll fold it over and I'll be trimming from the top this time. Hope that made sense. So I just pulled this one off, but I'm not going to go like this because then these holly leaves are climbing up and these are down. And I would like them both to be down. So I'll be working from the bottom edge of the strip. And I'll be sewing from the bottom up like this. And I can see that this one also covers the corner, so that's good. And I'll press. And then trim this and feather stitch. And remember, when I feather stitch, I'm going to feather stitch from the top down. I'll use another vertical strip so I can demonstrate that again. If you're using a vertical strip, keep the top of the design at the top of the project. Overlap, I'm matching this up to the edge of this previous strip. These are 1 inch strips, and I'm overlapping the center line. I do that every time. Then I'm going to sew a 1/8 inch seam allowance right here, which is my needle all the way to the right. Now I'll flip this over and press it. And feather stitch from the top down. I will trim this strip at a 90-degree angle. And then for the second side, to keep this vertical, this print vertical, I'm going to match it up from the bottom and stitch up this way. Flip, and I'm just double checking to be sure that that print is still vertical. So the top of the tree print is at the top of the project. At this point, I'm kind of losing track of my center line, and also I've kind of overlapped on my foundation, and I'll trim that up in a second. I'm making sure this goes off the edge so that when I fold it back, it's tall enough to cover the tip. Fold it over, press, and feather stitch. And I think this will work for our last little strip. Now, ideally, those strips have perfectly covered my foundation. But if you find that you have a little bit of the, let me see if I can find this, hold on. Here we go. If you find that you have a little bit of the foundation showing at the top, you can use that triangle and just piece that last triangle piece on to cover the tip. That's why I like to use the same print for the start, for the triangle, and for the top strips. After calculating this and making it many times and switching up the width of the strips and the size of this and everything else, the seam allowance, I have found that this works well for me, but I am aware that different sewing machines are different, and honestly, I'm pretty sure that what I'm calling an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance might be a little bit bigger than an 1/8 of an inch. So what's the next one up? 3/16? Is that right? So I think I'm using really closer to a 3/16 of an inch seam allowance. But you can just, try it with your own machine and see what works for you. Now I'm going to do a little sort of a stay stitch around the edge of my pattern and then trim out the excess strips. I stitched that all the way around the edge from the back, and now I'll trim out all this extra. Now for the rickrack. I tried a couple of different sizes of rickrack. With this size of rickrack, I feel like all you see is rickrack and you miss out on the intricacy of the stitches. This one is perfect. It could even be smaller, but I didn't have any smaller right now. So I'm going to use this size, which came on this little, I don't even know. This is like a little group of holiday trims. I'll measure it. This is 3/8 of an inch wide. So I'm going to thread my machine with red thread and we will stitch that rickrack on. I like odd numbers and I try to get this to go 5 times, but it just didn't look right. So we're going to start here, and I always start on this side because I don't want it to be following the line of the embroidery. So we go against the line of the embroidery. I'll stitch to here and stop with my needle down, and then I'll just fold it back and stitch to the other side, and again stop with the needle down, and then fold this back over here, needle down, all the way to the edge, and then back to here, and I'm done. You can see how it's all the way to the edge so that the folds in the rickrack get stuck in the seam, and also that those folds are flat. So when I fold them, needle down and fold, I'm just kind of going with the rickrack. I'm just kind of folding it over. It's not hard. Here's how it looks. There's a little bump in that one, but it didn't cause me any trouble. Needle down, and then I just sort of pivot and then stitch, needle down, pivot, stitch off the edge. I don't worry too much about getting the angles exactly the same or whatever. Next is the trunk. I've used a 3-inch piece of brown velvet ribbon. You could also use grosgrain. My ribbon is 5/8 of an inch wide. It could be less, it could be more. And I'm going to fold it in half. Kind of fold this to determine the center. And then set that right there. And I have it extending about, there's a 1/4 of an inch overlap there. I want to be sure that I catch both ends in the seam, and I'm going to stitch this down. So when the project's done, that will be a little trunk. I'll just pin this to a backing and stitch around the edge. I like to leave it open right here, and that's where I stuff it. So it stuffs from behind the trunk. So I'll start here, stitch around, and end here. It looks like that. I sewed it with green thread, and now I'll cut this out and turn it to the right side. Of course, I sewed it right sides together. Here's my opening right here. That should be enough room. I think I'll trim the seam allowance right here so I can turn to a nice point. It's turned to the right side, and now I will stuff it with fiberfill through this little opening. That feels just about right. I'll turn this in, this little seam allowance on the back, and I'm going to pin that and stitch the opening closed by hand. I think my trunk is a little bit off center, but that's okay, it'll look cute. I'm using green thread, but I don't have any green quilting thread or hand sewing thread, so I have machine thread, and I'll just hope for the best. I'm using a ladder stitch. There we go, that looks good. Now for the hanging loop, I'm going to use baker's twine. Just stitch it through the top. I like the look of it so much that I decided to add a bow, also from the baker's twine. And then I don't want to use glue on this, so I'm going to just tie the loops into an additional overhand knot. And then for the streamers, I'll just tie those off so that they won't fray. I like the bow to sort of flop over to the side. Now I promised that I would show you the pattern. Here it is. This pattern is 4.5 inches tall and 4 inches wide. 4.5 tall, 4 inches wide. Just cut a rectangle with those dimensions and fold it in half, and then cut a nice rounded bottom, and then a pointed top with a little bit of an arch at the top. I'm gonna leave this here for a second so you can get a good look. It's surprising how you start with something like this, and then once you stuff it, it becomes more of a triangle shape. It becomes more of a pointy triangle shape. This is just right. I worked hard on this. 4.5 tall, 4 inches wide, fold it in half, and cut a rounded bottom here, then up to the top, and then a little taper to the top, like this. There are lots of possibilities with this project. You could add hand-embroidered French knots, beads, sequins, or even, die-cut little shapes to decorate the tree. It's really fun to use up scraps. Thank you for watching my tutorial. If you're enjoying my videos, please like, share, and subscribe.